I want to make sure everyone can hear me. Am I coming through okay? All right. In 1878, a constitutional amendment was accepted for consideration by Congress. That proposed amendment read, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation," end quote. This proposed amendment, pushed by leading suffragists Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was reintroduced annually, but failed to pass for 42 years. Finally, on June 4th, 1919, Congress passed the 19th Amendment, acknowledging women's legal right to vote. That amendment was ratified on August 18, 1920. We are indebted to our feminist foremothers for advancing women's rights and combating their oppression in our society. But as we sit in the comfort of the present, let us do more than merely praise these achievements. Let us also contemplate the insight and the wisdom taught by those who made these advances. Let us strive to emulate the best of their imperfect example and also learn from their failings. Doing so enables us to not only realize the fuller humanity of women, but I think it also equips us to today wrestle with our greatest present challenges, including creeping autocracy in the executive branch, plutocratic exploitation of working people, climate catastrophe, social and political polarization, and the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and white supremacy. Now, 71 years before the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and female Quakers hosted the Seneca Falls Convention, the first major large public convention advocating for women's rights. The abolitionist Lucretia Mott was in part inspired to organize this convention after she and other abolitionists were prevented from meaningfully participating in the 1840 anti-slavery convention in London, famously placed behind a curtain and prevented from speaking. 3 years later, after that historic convention, Stanton met Susan B. Anthony. The two became lifelong friends and allies in the fight for women's equality. In 1872, Anthony and 13 other women succeeded in voting. The only problem, as you likely know, is that they did so against the law in Rochester, New York. Anthony was later arrested and put on trial, and as the scholars Susan Shaw and Janet Lee relay, she appeared before Congress from 1869 to 1906 to ask for passage of a suffrage amendment. Even in her senior years, Anthony remained active in the cause of suffrage, presiding over the National American Women's Suffrage Association from 1892 to 1900, end quote. Now, as we commemorate 100 years of suffrage, on the one hand, quite a long time in an individual lifetime. On the other hand, just a very recent event in the history of human civilization. Let us contemplate the significance of the fact Susan B. Anthony labored for women's rights for 50 years, but died 14 years before women would finally achieve the right to vote. What lesson does Susan B. Anthony's tireless labor leading up to her death offer us today? As an activist, I've heard some say that social change activism is the work of the young. But Anthony's life and work stands as a powerful rebuke to this stance. She fought for women's rights into her 80s, and she teaches us there is no retirement for those of healthy body and mind and spirit from paying our debt of expanded dignity owed to prior generations. Yet striving to combat oppression and honor human dignity is best viewed not merely as paying a debt. Instead, we should view this labor as the activation and the development of our fullest humanity. After all, how can good, loving, compassionate people sit idly by while others suffer or are denied the fullness of their dignity? Anthony and many of her colleagues answer this question clearly. They can't. They can't sit idly by. Our feminist foremothers teach us an important lesson for the present. They teach us that repeated failure is not evidence that one cannot eventually succeed. Anthony's efforts to achieve women's right to vote reveals the irrationality of insisting on the past, the fallacy of judging what is possible in the present and the future by strictly referring to what was or has been achieved or not achieved in the past. She teaches us that progress and justice are dead without faithful and imaginative conviction in one's cause. She teaches us that deferring to the supposedly prudent pragmatists whose voices forever protect the status quo, who always clamor for waiting and in the future perhaps we'll get there, that abiding by those voices is a death sentence to social transformation and with it human liberty. It is also important for us, I think, to think about the importance of having allies who have comparative privilege to those who are being marginalized. As I've attempted to explore in some of my own scholarship, feminist men have long been an important, integral, though imperfect, participants in the struggle for women's rights. You can go back to the French philosopher Nicolas de Condorcet, who was an aristocrat who supported the abolition of slavery and also fought to help overturn monarchy during the French Revolution. In 1790, Condorcet wrote an essay called On Giving Women the Right of Citizenship. And in that essay, Condorcet wrote, "The rights of men stem exclusively from the fact that they are sentient beings capable of acquiring moral ideas and of reasoning upon them. Either no individual of the human species has any true rights, or all have the same. And he who votes against the rights of another, of whatever religion, color, or sex, has thereby abjured his own." Again, those are words of a man of privilege written in 1790, more than 130 years before women succeeded in winning the right to vote in the United States. What I think a lot of us don't realize is that at the Seneca Falls Convention, just 1/3 of the attendees signed that declaration of sentiments and resolutions, primarily written by Stanton. Many supporters of expanding women's rights found that the document's demand for women's suffrage was just beyond the pale. Even some of not only their male but female allies objected to including this resolution. But one of the staunchest and most eloquent defenders of including the resolution that women ought to have the right to vote was none other than the former slave Frederick Douglass, who wrote, or rather said, and later published his remarks, "All that distinguishes man as an intelligent and accountable being is equally true of woman. And if that government only is just is just, which governs by the free consent of the governed, there can be no reason in the world for denying to women the exercise of the elective franchise or a hand in making and administering the laws of the land, end quote. But I want you to keep in mind that this position articulated here by a male ally was beyond the pale for many. It was beyond the pale for many in the abolitionist movement from which so many suffragists emerged. 3 years after Seneca Falls, the abolitionist and itinerant preacher Sojourner Truth, former slave woman, delivered a speech at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. Truth drew on her experience to tell the truth and to explode the male-conceived myths of femininity that were so popular at the time. In the earliest transcription of her speech, we read Truth saying, "I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed. And can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and can eat as much too, if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now," end quote. And as for the idea of women's intellectual inferiority, Truth identified the unfairness of depriving women the full development of their capabilities, satirizing their argument by saying, as for intellect, all I can say is, if women have a pint and man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear we will take too much, for we can't take more than our pint will hold. And clearly, Truth here is not accepting the presumption of male intellectual superiority, but simply pointing out that if women are limited by some kind of biological inferiority, then certainly they won't be able to surpass men. Born to free Black parents in 1825, yet another important advocate of suffrage, Frances Harper lent her intellectual capabilities to both abolition and suffrage. In 1858, Harper, who also wrote poetry and is one of the earliest Black female authors of fiction in our nation, refused to give up her seat and refused to ride in the colored section of a segregated trolley in Philadelphia, some 100 years before Rosa Parks' iconic stance. And during the 1866 National Women's Rights Convention, and then later in the 1869 American Equal Rights Association Convention, Harper challenged her white female counterparts to recognize and try to better understand the unique experience and plight of Black women, faced not only with the denial of their rights from the elite male world, but also to recognize the discrimination they encountered among white women who, for example, she notes, refused to work with a Black woman when she was given a working class position. Now keep this in mind. Harper died in 1911. Truth died in 1883. And neither of these Black women tasted the fruits of their struggle for women's suffrage. That many working for women's social equality never witnessed the fruits of their labor, it reminds us that the egoistic demand for immediate results, that I'm not going to put my time and energy and struggle if I don't get to dine on the fruits of that labor, if I don't see results today or tomorrow or in 5 years or in 10 years. It reminds us that this egoistic demand is yet another obstacle to effecting social change. Our foremothers, in all of their imperfections, teach us that these successes won in one age are born out of the long, tiresome, and seemingly fruitless toil of preceding ages, that they are the achievements often of great sacrifice by those who do not get to benefit the way that many of us do today. Appreciating the labors of our foremothers requires a deeper understanding of the male supremacist cultural context that is difficult for us to really fathom, at least many of us, because it confounds our contemporary moral compass. Consider the grievances that were listed in that Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. In that statement, which was signed by 68 women, but importantly by 32 men, it reads, quote, "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpation on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world." What facts were submitted? Well, among them, the denial of women to a thorough education, all colleges being closed to her. The denial of women avenues to wealth and distinction, including opportunities in theology, medicine, and law. And as the statement read, as wife in marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, he becoming to all intents and purposes her master. The reality of this circumstance is clear from the fact that the law allows him, end quote, to deprive her of her liberty and to administer her chastisement. Chastisement is a euphemism for physically disciplining one's wife. Early feminists struck at the oppressive foundation of the family, namely the presumption that the husband was a miniature king entitled to mete out punishment as he saw fit. To really grasp what it meant to be a woman in the 19th century, consider that in 1864, the Court of North Carolina wrote that a husband is responsible for the acts of his wife, and he is required to govern his household. And for that purpose, the law permits him to use towards his wife such a degree of force as is necessary to control an unruly temper and make her behave herself, end quote. Thus, the husband was accorded powers of punishment over everyone in his household, including his wife. And keep in mind that this ruling was written 16 years after the Seneca Falls Convention and the issuance of that Declaration of Sentiments. The court went on to make it clear that husbands were not permitted to inflict permanent injury or to use excessive violence or enact such a degree of cruelty as shows that it is inflicted to gratify his own bad passions, end quote. But barring those instances, the court made it clear the state will not go behind the domestic curtain where man is expected to rule. Just how ordinary these appalling, repugnant ideas to our contemporary moral conscience is made clear in an 1871 ruling in Massachusetts. Now, this ruling was actually overturning the right of the husband to, quote unquote, chastise his wife. But in their ruling, they acknowledged what used to be the norms of society. They said that the state no longer recognized the privilege, ancient though it be, to beat her with a stick, and I'm quoting here, to pull her hair, to choke her, to spit in her face, or kick her about the floor, or to inflict upon her like indignities, end quote. This is the world in which our feminist foremothers, with all of their imperfections, which perhaps we can discuss after the presentation, we need to recognize that in addition to achieving the right to vote, our feminist foremothers also led the way for the elimination of men's legal right to discipline their wives, because 2020 is not only the centennial of women gaining the right to vote, it is also the centennial of women finally getting the protection across the union from chastisement by their husbands. So it wasn't until 1920 that all existing laws were removed permitting husbands to legally violently abuse their wives. And it wasn't until the second wave, 1970s feminist movement, that we had the beginning of the domestic violence shelter movement and so forth. I want to close with what I think are some important insights from Susan B. Anthony. Despite the pretense usually given, the appeal to moderation, the idea that one must always strike in the middle of the two presently extreme positions within the culture, is not so much motivated by reason or intellect as advocates of the approach of moderation would have you believe. What our feminist foremothers teach us, as do the leaders of other crucial movements, including abolition and civil rights, is that the appeal to moderation is quite often motivated by cowardice, privilege, and complacency. Acknowledging this is actually pretty difficult because it requires us to look honestly within ourselves and realize that however morally and politically enlightened that we imagine ourselves, most of these insights, not only the liberties that our society now has crystallized and celebrates during 4th of July celebrations and so on, but also the consciousness, the conscience of its population is largely the result of the fruits of someone else's labor. We stand against classism, I hope, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and the like, not because we are more inherently good compared to those who've come before us. For the most part, we are the benefactors of those who came before us and not only cleared the political terrain to expand our liberties, but they also cleared the path for us toward moral clarity. Standing for principles and causes when they have been woven into the fabric of dominant culture is no great achievement of conscience or character. Standing for the morally right position against power, culturally determined prudence, is something quite different. When the judge announced Susan B. Anthony's guilty verdict for illegally voting and stated that she would be fined $100, she responded this way: "I will never pay $1 of your unjust penalty. All the stock and trade I possess is a debt of $10,000 incurred by publishing my paper, The Revolution, the sole object of which was to educate all women to do precisely as I have done, rebel against your man-made, unjust, unconstitutional forms of law which tax, fine, imprison, and hang women while denying them the right of representation in the government. And I will work on with might and main to pay every dollar of that honest debt, but not a penny shall go to this unjust claim. And I shall earnestly and persistently continue to urge all women to do to those who were, and I shall earnestly and persistently continue to urge all women to the practical recognition of the old revolutionary maxim, resistance to tyranny is obedience to God." Our problem, I think, I'll close with this, is that those today who make the loudest and the most institutionally recognized pronouncements on moral, political, and I would say spiritual principles are usually those with the least significant role in cultivating and enacting those changes. What's more, fearful obedience to power and unthinking conformity to the status quo is never in short supply. Yet the best values and traditions that are today woven into a solidified set of cultural norms were produced by incendiary spirits who followed Eve's noble footsteps of defiance when she ate from that tree of knowledge. We must remember that the fruit of knowledge was earned through the labor of disobedience, a reverent disobedience that simultaneously gave birth to human freedom. And so I'll let Susan B. Anthony have the last words when she declared in 1860, cautious, careful people, always casting about to preserve their reputation and social standing, never can bring about a reform. Those who are really in earnest must be willing to be anything or nothing in the world's estimation, and publicly and privately, in season and out, avow their sympathy with despised and persecuted ideas and their advocates and bear the consequences, end quote. Our feminist foremothers call us to follow Eve in courageous pursuit of something greater, something more human than obedience to tradition and authority and moderation. They call us to reverence for life in all of its poetic, even if disassembling dynamism. Thank you.